She snapped her fingers and pointed to the door, telling me to fetch the expensive sparkling water for our Japanese investors. She thought she was putting me in my place. She didn't realize she was handing me the weapon to end her career. I didn't cause a scene. I simply stood up, looked the client in the eye, and delivered a single sentence in fluent Japanese that turned a $1.2 billion deal into dust. Before I tell you exactly what I said to make the CEO of a global conglomerate walk out in silence, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever had a boss who mistook your silence for weakness, hit that subscribe button. You're going to enjoy this. My name is Morgan Vance, and for the better part of 2 decades, I have defined my professional existence through the rigorous, unforgiving discipline of structural architecture. In a city like Seattle, where the skyline is a constant, high-stakes negotiation between human ambition and the volatile geology of the Pacific Ring of Fire, my role was never merely about creating beautiful silhouettes against the clouds. It was about the invisible mathematics, the silent physics that kept those glass towers from shattering when the earth moved. I served as the lead architect for the firm's International Development Division, a position earned not through nepotism or networking at cocktail parties, but through 15 years of calculating shear loads, memorizing obscure zoning codes, and staring at geotechnical surveys until the numbers danced behind my eyelids. I was 45 years old, a woman who preferred tailored charcoal suits and spoke in the precise, measured cadence of someone who knows that a single decimal point in the wrong place can cost lives. I believed, perhaps with a naive sort of nobility, that in the world of billion-dollar infrastructure, competence was the only currency that truly held value. I believed that right up until the moment Mercer, our chief executive officer, decided that the firm's image was too clinical and hired Sloan to shake things up. Sloan was 29, a creative director poached from a failed tech incubator in Silicon Valley, a woman who viewed architecture not as a science of shelter and safety, but as content to be consumed and monetized. She arrived with a vocabulary consisting entirely of buzzwords disruption, synergy, optical velocity, and a profound, almost aggressive lack of interest in how buildings actually stood up. To Sloan, I was an artifact of a bygone era, a legacy employee whose obsession with safety codes was a hindrance to her vision of Instagrammable spaces. The systematic erosion of my authority was not an accident. It was a calculated campaign designed to marginalize me. It began subtly, with meetings rescheduled without my input and emails regarding design changes where I was moved from the 2 line to the CC line, and eventually dropped altogether. But the declaration of open warfare happened on a rainy Tuesday morning in Conference Room B, a space I had physically designed 10 years ago to maximize natural light during the gray Seattle winters. We were gathering for the kickoff of the Kaido Tower project, a massive $1.2 billion mixed-use development funded by the Kaido Corporation of Japan. This was the whale client, the contract that would secure the firm's financial future for the next decade. I arrived 10 minutes early, as was my custom, placing my leather-bound portfolio and the preliminary soil analysis reports at the head of the mahogany table. I had spent the weekend reviewing the site's liquefaction potential, and I was prepared to discuss the absolute necessity of deep pile foundations. The room was quiet, filled with the low hum of the HVAC system and the nervous energy of the junior associates who knew that this project could make or break their careers. Then, the double doors swung open, and the quiet was shattered. Sloan walked in, not walking so much as performing an entrance, wearing a neon-bright ensemble that screamed for attention against the muted tones of the office. She was followed by Paxton, her executive assistant, a young man who functioned less as a support staff and more as a sycophantic echo, clutching her iced coffee like a holy relic. Sloan did not say good morning. She did not acknowledge the team. She marched directly to the head of the table where I was sitting. She stood there, looking down at me, her smile tight and predatory, a weaponized expression of faux politeness. "Morgan," she announced, her voice pitched loud enough to ensure everyone in the room, and perhaps the hallway, could hear. "We are pivoting the energy for this project. I need to drive the creative vision from the captain's chair, so why don't you relocate to the corner by the whiteboard? You can handle the minutes today. It is best to let the visionaries steer the ship while you document the logistics." We don't want to bog down the flow with too much technical drag. The room went paralyzed. It was a calculated public evisceration. She was not just asking for a seat. She was stripping me of my rank in front of the very people I was supposed to lead. The soil report, the foundation strategy, the seismic analysis, all of it was being dismissed as logistics in favor of her vision. In that moment, the insult burned in my chest like a physical weight. But I knew that reacting with anger was exactly what she wanted. She wanted the angry older woman narrative. She wanted me to raise my voice so she could label me emotional and difficult. I refused to give her that satisfaction. I slowly closed my portfolio, the sound of the leather slapping shut echoing in the silence. I stood up, picked up my pen, and moved to the side chair in the shadows of the room. I sat with my spine rigid, opening a fresh page in my notebook. I did not look at her. I wrote down the date, the time, and her exact words. I was no longer just an architect. I was now a witness, building a case. The meeting that followed was a masterclass in incompetence. Sloan spent 45 minutes clicking through a slide deck that featured images of clouds, flowing water, and abstract shapes, talking about emotional resonance and vertical neighborhoods. When I raised my hand to point out that the glass curtain wall she was proposing would act as a solar oven in the summer, increasing the cooling load by 30% and violating the city's new energy efficiency codes, she waved a hand dismissively. "Morgan, please," she sighed, rolling her eyes at Paxton, who snickered. "Stop trying to kill the dream with math. We can figure out the boring stuff later. Right now, we are dreaming." I wrote that down too. Creative director prioritizes dreaming over municipal energy codes. Potential liability. High. The entire hour was a farce, but it was only the prelude to the disaster that was looming on the horizon. The Kaido delegation was scheduled to arrive in 3 days for the formal signing ceremony and design review. Dealing with Japanese corporate culture is a delicate art form. It requires humility, precision, and a deep respect for hierarchy. I had spent my entire career cultivating these relationships, understanding that for a man like Chairman Kaido, the process was as important as the result. I spent that evening at home, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of wine that I didn't drink, drafting a comprehensive protocol and cultural sensitivity document. I detailed everything: the specific angle of the bow, the order in which tea should be served, the necessity of silence during the chairman's contemplation, and most importantly, the seating chart. In the boardroom, the kamiza, the seat of honor, is sacrosanct. It must be the chair furthest from the door, facing the entrance, backing a solid wall. To put a guest of honor anywhere else is to treat them as a servant or a subordinate. I created a visual diagram, color-coded and labeled, explicitly placing Chairman Kaido in the kamiza and placing Sloan and Mercer in the host positions opposite him. I sent this document with a high-importance flag to Sloan, Mercer, and the entire coordination team. The subject line was clear: critical protocol, Kaido delegation, visit, compliance required. I expected pushback, perhaps a discussion about logistics, but I did not expect the sheer arrogance of the response I received the next morning. Sloan replied to the entire thread. Her email was written in a casual, breezy font that seemed to mock the seriousness of the content. "Morgan," it read, "thank you for the history lesson, but we need to stop living in the feudal era. This is a modern, American, female-led creative team. We do not bow to anyone. We shake hands. We look them in the eye, and regarding the chairs, I will be sitting at the head of the table. I am the face of this project, and I want them to see that we are disrupting the old boys club. We lead, they follow. Let's not kill the vibe with too many rules. Trust the energy." I stared at the screen, reading the words twice to ensure I hadn't hallucinated them. She was not just rejecting my advice, she was framing basic diplomatic respect as a weakness. She was confusing cultural illiteracy with feminism, and she was about to insult a 70-year-old traditionalist who controlled $1 billion of capital. I didn't reply. I didn't storm into her office. I simply printed her email, stapled it to my original protocol document, and walked over to the physical file cabinet in the corner of my office. I placed it in a folder I had labeled Risk Assessment. Then, I opened my secure messaging app and texted Oren, our lead structural engineer, and the only other person in the building who understood that gravity didn't care about vibes. My message was 3 words. Log everything. Now. Oren didn't ask questions. He knew. The morning of the summit arrived with a torrential downpour, the kind of Seattle rain that turns the sky the color of wet slate. Inside the office, however, the atmosphere was chaotic for entirely different reasons. Sloan had decided to curate the experience. She had ordered the removal of the sleek, mid-century modern furniture I had selected for the boardroom furniture that whispered of stability and permanence, and replaced it. In its place, she had rented heavy, ornate chairs upholstered in crushed red velvet and draped the tables in gold-threaded runners. She had placed lanterns around the room, but they were not the understated Andon lamps of Japan. They were bright red, tasseled lanterns that looked like they had been purchased from a discount party supply store's generic Asia aisle. It was a visual assault, a confused mishmash of Chinese and Hollywood aesthetics that screamed ignorance. When I walked in to check the sound system, the sight actually made me pause. It was offensive. It was a caricature. And standing in the middle of it was Sloan, wearing a dress that was stunning for a gala but catastrophic for a conservative business meeting, sleeveless, plunging neckline, and bright crimson, a color often associated with death or funerals in certain contexts when used improperly. I stood in the back corner, near the AV rack, dressed in my armor, a high-collared black suit, no jewelry, hair pulled back tight. I checked the microphone levels, my hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the suppressed urge to scream. I checked the time. The delegation was in the elevator. I looked at the table. Sloan had placed herself at the head, just as she threatened. She had placed Chairman Kaito's name card near the door, in the spot usually reserved for the most junior note-taker. It was a deliberate power play, a way to physically force him to look up to her. She was banking everything on the idea that her charisma would overpower centuries of tradition. The elevator chimed. The glass doors slid open. The air in the reception area seemed to change pressure. Chairman Kaito stepped out first. He was a man of small stature but immense presence, dressed in a bespoke suit that cost more than Sloane's car. He was flanked by 4 advisors and his personal interpreter. They moved with a synchronized, quiet grace, their eyes scanning the space with critical precision. Sloan did not wait. She did not let them enter fully. She surged forward, her heels clicking loudly on the polished concrete. "Welcome to Seattle," she shouted, throwing her arms wide. She bypassed the bow. She bypassed the handshake. She went in for a hug. The moment stretched into an eternity. I watched as Chairman Kaito's eyes widened, a flash of genuine shock breaking his composure. He took a sharp, rigid step backward, almost colliding with his interpreter. His body language was a scream of violation. In his world, physical contact is rare and reserved for intimate family. A hug from a stranger, a foreign woman in a red dress, was an assault on his dignity. His assistant stepped smoothly between them, acting as a human shield, blocking Sloane's advance. Sloane stopped, her arms still raised in the air, looking like a confused child. "Oh, okay, strictly business, I respect that," she laughed, the sound shrill and nervous. "We're just very warm here. Come on in, let's get this party started." She turned and strutted toward the conference room, oblivious to the fact that the delegation had not moved. Chairman Kaito stood still, adjusting his cuffs, his face a mask of cold stone. He looked around the lobby, his gaze taking in the red lanterns, the chaotic energy, and finally, he looked at me. I was standing perfectly still in the shadows. I met his eyes. I did not smile. I lowered my eyes and executed a perfect saikere, the deepest, most respectful bow, bending 45 degrees at the waist, holding it for a count of 3. It was a silent apology. It was a signal that someone here understood who he was. When I rose, he was looking at me with a new expression, curiosity perhaps, or relief. He gave a barely perceptible nod, a single sharp dip of his chin, and then signaled his team to follow him into the room. The boardroom was a disaster scene waiting to ignite. Sloan took her seat at the head of the table, beaming. "Please, sit anywhere. We don't stand on ceremony here," she chirped. The advisors looked at the name cards, then at the chairman. They were paralyzed. For them to sit while their chairman was placed in the lowest seat was unthinkable. Chairman Kaido, however, was a master of strategy. He did not complain. He walked to the seat near the door, the servant's seat, and sat down with absolute dignity. His advisors remained standing for a frantic moment before he gestured for them to sit. The hierarchy was broken. The room was inverted. And the tension was so thick it felt like static electricity on the skin. Sloane launched into her presentation. She stood up, pacing around the room, using a laser pointer to circle vague shapes on the screen. "We want the Kaido Tower to breathe," she said. "We want it to feel like a living organism. We're moving away from rigid structures and embracing the flow." "The flow," she repeated, looking for approval. The advisors were taking notes furiously, but they weren't noting her ideas, they were noting her mistakes. 10 minutes into the monologue, Tanaka, the lead technical advisor for Kaido Corp., raised his hand. He was a man with a face like weathered teak, a structural engineer with 40 years of experience. He did not look at the pretty pictures. He looked at the data table, or the lack thereof. "Miss Sloane," he said, his English heavily accented but grammatically perfect. "I am looking at the footprint of the tower. You have removed the sheer walls from the lower lobby to create this open flow. In a Zone 3 seismic region, what is your calculation for the lateral drift during a magnitude 7 event? How does the building not collapse?" The question hung in the air. It was the question. The only question that mattered. Sloane stopped pacing. She looked at the screen. She looked at Paxton. Paxton was frantically tapping on his iPad, sweat beading on his forehead, but there was no answer there because they hadn't done the math. "They had deleted my shear walls because they looked ugly in the render." Sloane's smile faltered, the corners of her mouth twitching. She needed an escape. She needed to deflect the technical scrutiny until she could bully the engineering team into faking a solution later. She needed a scapegoat to break the tension. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate, wild, until they landed on me. I was sitting in the back corner, the secretary chair, with the thick binder of original structural plans on my lap. I knew the answer. I knew the drift coefficient down to the third decimal. I saw her look at me, and for a split second, I thought she might ask for help. I thought she might say, "Our lead architect can explain," but I was wrong. Her ego would not allow her to yield the floor to me. Instead, she saw a prop. She saw a way to reassert her dominance over the room by lowering mine. She turned to the table, her smile widening into something brittle and cruel. She pointed a manicured finger at me. "Gentlemen, let's not get bogged down in the boring numbers right now. We can email you the spreadsheets. Right now, we are sensing the space." She turned her gaze to me, her eyes hard and cold. "Morgan," she snapped, using the tone one uses to summon a negligent waiter. "While the creatives are ideating, why don't you be useful? Go grab us some sparkling water. The expensive kind from the executive fridge. And hurry up, don't make the chairman wait. We need to keep the energy fresh." She snapped her fingers. Snap! The sound was sharp, dry, and incredibly loud in the silent room. Time seemed to warp. I sat there, the binder heavy on my knees. I looked at her hand, still suspended in the air, the finger pointing toward the door. I looked at the Japanese delegation. They were frozen. Their faces were masks of absolute shock. In their culture, competence is revered, and seniority is sacred. To see a senior executive treat another senior professional, a woman of my age and standing like a servant in the middle of a negotiation, was not just rude, it was a breakdown of societal order. It signaled that this company had no honor, no structure, and no discipline. I could hear the hum of the projector fan. I could hear Paxton's shallow breathing. I could hear the blood rushing in my own ears, a roar of adrenaline. This was it. This was the moment she had been building toward for months. She wanted to break me. She wanted me to stand up, flush with humiliation, and scurry out of the room to fetch her water, cementing my status as the office maid. Or, she wanted me to explode, to scream at her so she could call security. I did neither. I stood up slowly, the motion controlled and fluid. I placed the binder on the empty chair next to me. I buttoned my jacket. I did not look at Sloane. I did not acknowledge her command or her finger. I turned my entire body toward Chairman Kaido. I walked 2 steps closer to the table, entering the inner circle. I stood tall, hands clasped in front of me, and I looked him directly in the eyes. I let the silence stretch for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Then, I spoke. "Kaido Kaicho," I began, my voice dropping into the lower, resonant register of formal Japanese business dialect, a language I had spent 15 years mastering for this exact project. "I deeply apologize for the profound lack of preparation and the shameful display of disrespect you have witnessed today. The seismic isolation data your advisor requested is on page 42 of this report, which was rejected by this management team as unnecessary." Sloane's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stared at me, her eyes wide, realizing too late that the secretary in the corner possessed a weapon she hadn't bothered to check for. I continued, my eyes never leaving the chairman's. "I have served this firm for 15 years, but I cannot in good conscience allow you to invest a single yen in a structure where the foundation is as unstable as the leadership presenting it. This design is unsafe. This leadership is untrustworthy. And I am afraid I cannot fetch the water, for I am too busy saving my dignity from this incompetence." The Japanese language has many levels of politeness. I had chosen the level used by a samurai speaking to a lord, respectful but brutally, suicidally honest. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum after an explosion. Chairman Kaido looked at me. His expression shifted, the stony mask cracked, replaced by a look of profound, recognized sorrow. He understood. He understood that I had just sacrificed my career to save his investment. He stood up. He did not look at Sloane. He did not look at the red lanterns. He buttoned his jacket with a sharp, decisive motion. "Thank you," he said in English, his voice clear and cutting through the room. "We appreciate the truth." He turned to his team and spoke one soft command in Japanese. "We are leaving." The delegation stood in unison, the sound of 5 chairs scraping back against the floor, sounding like a gavel strike. They turned and filed out of the room, their movements synchronized, leaving the crushed velvet chairs empty. They walked past Sloane as if she were a ghost. Sloane stood there, her hands still half raised, her face draining of color until she looked like a wax statue. The door clicked shut behind the last advisor. For 5 seconds, nobody moved. Then, the reality hit. The deal was gone. The $1 billion was gone. Sloane turned to me, her face twisting from shock into a grotesque mask of panic and fury. She looked at the empty chairs, then at me. "What did you say?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Then she screamed, a high, piercing sound. "What did you say to him? You sabotaged me. You turned them against me." My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a push notification from the executive server, forwarded by Oren. "Kaido Corp has formally withdrawn from negotiations. Reason cited: lack of leadership integrity." I looked at Sloane. I looked at the red lantern swaying gently in the air conditioning. I didn't say anything they didn't already see. "Sloane," I said, my voice calm, almost bored. "I just translated it for you. I picked up my personal bag. I'll be at my desk packing. You might want to check your email. I think Mercer is going to want an explanation for why the whale just swam away." I walked out of the conference room, leaving her standing in the wreckage of her own ego. The hallway was quiet, but as I walked toward my office, I saw the heads of the junior staff popping up from their cubicles, eyes wide. They knew. Everyone knew. The Queen was dead. She just hadn't stopped twitching yet. I walked into my office and closed the door. My hands were finally shaking. I sat down and exhaled. A long, shuddering breath. I knew what was coming next. The legal threats. The HR investigation. The blame game. But for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid. I had the logs. I had the files. And I had the truth. The demolition was over. Now, it was time for the excavation. The silence that descended upon my office in the wake of the disaster was brief, shattered almost immediately by the shrill, demanding ring of the telephone. It was not the internal extension usually reserved for collegial chats. It was the direct line from the executive suite, a sound I had learned to associate with imminent corporate restructuring. I let it ring 3 times, using those few seconds to straighten the framed architectural license on my wall and breathe in the scent of old blueprints and dust one last time. When I finally lifted the receiver, Mercer's voice greeted me, stripped entirely of the polished warmth he usually reserved for senior leadership. He did not ask for my version of events, nor did he inquire as to why a billion-dollar client had just walked out of our building in a state of quiet fury. He simply informed me, with the detached efficiency of a man reading a script, that I was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full internal investigation into what he termed gross misconduct and the deliberate sabotage of client relations. I did not argue. I did not attempt to explain that I was the only person in that room who had tried to uphold the firm's dignity. I simply replied, "I understand the protocol, Mercer," and placed the receiver back in its cradle with a gentle click. I packed a single cardboard box with my license certification, a few personal photographs, and my favorite drafting pen. I did not look back at the open plan office as I walked to the elevator, though I could feel the eyes of the junior architects burning into my back. They believed they were watching a funeral procession, witnessing the tragic end of a legacy employee who couldn't adapt to the new regime. They did not realize they were actually watching a tactical withdrawal. As the elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the chaotic workspace, I checked my wristwatch. It was exactly 11 o'clock. By my estimation, Sloan would need approximately 20 minutes to stop hyperventilating and start thinking about self-preservation. Once the initial panic subsided, her instinct would not be to fix the relationship with the Kaido Corporation. She lacked the cultural literacy to even attempt it. Her instinct would be to rewrite history. To survive, she needed to construct a narrative where I was the villain, the bitter, antiquated employee who had deliberately insulted the guests to spite her brilliant vision. And to build that narrative, she would need to erase the evidence of her own negligence. I drove home through the relentless Seattle drizzle, the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers matching the steady, calculated beat of my heart. My house was a sanctuary of clean lines and structural order, a stark contrast to the messy, crumbling foundation I had just left behind. I brewed a pot of Earl Grey tea, sat down at my dining table, and opened my personal laptop. Technically, my access to the company email and shared drives should have been revoked the moment Mercer hung up the phone. However, the information technology department was chronically understaffed, and the director of IT owed me a significant professional debt for identifying a critical ventilation flaw in the server room the previous year. My credentials were still active, but I did not log in to the standard employee interface. Instead, I accessed the remote monitoring portal for the secure document server, a back-end view that showed file activity and audit trails rather than the files themselves. I sipped my tea, watching the screen like a hawk circling prey, and waited. At 11:45, the first red flag appeared on my monitor. The user ID Creative Director Sloan had accessed the Kaido project archives. I watched the digital footprint of her panic unfold in real time. First, she opened the folder containing the meeting minutes from the previous 3 months. Then, she navigated to the subfolder labeled Risk Assessments. This was the repository where I had meticulously stored every warning, every seismic report, and every protocol guide I had ever sent her. On my screen, a command line appeared: *action, delete. File, protocol, seating, chart, PDF. I did not flinch. I did not reach for the phone to stop her. I simply watched as she systematically attempted to purge the drive, deleting the engineering reports and the cultural guides, likely believing that once the files were in the digital trash bin, they were gone forever. She was operating under the assumption that the company's server functioned like her personal laptop. She did not understand the concept of shadow volume copies or strict data retention policies required for liability insurance. Every time she hit delete, she was not destroying evidence. She was creating a permanent, time-stamped log of her intent to cover up her tracks. It was a trap I didn't even have to set. I just had to let her walk into it. My phone buzzed with a text message from Oren, my ally in engineering. It was a single, grainy image taken surreptitiously from across the office floor. It showed Sloan and her assistant Paxton huddled over a single computer terminal, their faces pale and frantic. Below the image, Oren had written a simple caption: Asterisk. They are rewriting the meeting transcript. They are changing the record to say, you volunteered to get the water. Asterisk. I allowed myself a very small, very cold smile. Falsifying corporate records was a far more serious offense than bad interior design or a breach of etiquette. She was crossing the line from incompetence into fraud, and she was dragging the company's liability insurance down with her. I closed my laptop. I had seen enough. I spent the next 2 days gardening, pruning the hydrangeas with precise, sharp cuts, removing the dead weight to let the healthy branches breathe. It was meditative work, a physical manifestation of what I was about to do to the firm. I did not answer the frantic voicemails from human resources. I let the silence grow, let it become heavy and uncomfortable for them, forcing them to sweat in the vacuum of my absence. By the third morning, the summons finally arrived via courier. It was a formal letter, requiring my presence at a special session of the board of directors at 10 o'clock the following day. The language was severe, utilizing terms like disciplinary hearing and termination for cause. They were expecting a fight. They were expecting me to come in begging for my pension, or perhaps screaming about age discrimination and unfair treatment. They were not expecting a forensic autopsy. I arrived at the headquarters exactly 15 minutes early. The reception area was quiet, the receptionist avoiding my gaze as I signed in. I was escorted not to the glass-walled conference room where the disaster had taken place, but to the executive boardroom on the top floor, a room of dark mahogany and heavy soundproofing, a place where careers went to die. Mercer sat at the head of the table. To his right sat Linda, the director of human resources, looking exhausted. To his left sat the general counsel, a lawyer whose presence confirmed that they intended to fire me without severance. And at the far end of the table sat Sloan. She looked different than she had during the client meeting. The neon colors were gone, replaced by a modest, navy blue suit that looked like something a politician would wear to apologize for a scandal. Her hands were clasped tightly on the table, and she had a thick stack of papers in front of her. She looked up as I entered, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she quickly composed her face into an expression of wounded professionalism. Mercer instructed me to sit. "We are here to formally review the events of Tuesday," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue, "and to address the complaint filed against you by the creative director." Sloan cleared her throat and began her statement. She did not look at me. She addressed the general counsel, playing to the most dangerous person in the room. "It is difficult for me to even speak about this," she began, her voice trembling with a practiced fragility. "I have tried so hard to include Morgan in the new vision for this firm. I know change is hard for older employees. But on Tuesday, she crossed a line. I asked her, very politely, if she could perhaps facilitate some refreshments, as our catering staff was delayed. It was a standard request. But she snapped. She stood up and started shouting at Chairman Kaito in Japanese. It was aggressive, it was hostile, she terrified them. Mercer looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Morgan, you have heard the accusation, gross insubordination, deliberate sabotage. Do you have a statement?" The room was silent. The general counsel's pen hovered over his notepad. I looked at Sloan. She was holding her breath, waiting for me to call her a liar, waiting for the emotional outburst that would prove her point. "I do not have a statement," I said calmly. "I have metadata." I reached down and lifted my laptop onto the table, connecting it to the projector. "Every decision in this firm is based on evidence, Mercer. You are about to terminate a lead architect with 15 years of tenure. I assume you would want to be absolutely certain that your facts are correct." I opened the raw interface of the server's forensic log. "What you are looking at," I explained, "is the audit trail from the secure file server. It records every creation, modification, and deletion." I highlighted a block of text in red. At 11:45 a.m. on Tuesday, 20 minutes after the client walked out, the user Sloan initiated a bulk deletion command. The files she attempted to destroy were the very risk assessments and protocol guides I sent her weeks ago, the ones warning her about the exact disaster that occurred. Sloan shifted in her seat, her face paling. "I was cleaning up old files," she stammered. "It was just housekeeping." I ignored her and clicked on the next file. "And this," I said, "is the audio log. As the general counsel knows, the executive conference room records all meetings for transcription purposes. Sloane claims she politely asked for help. She claims I was aggressive. I pressed play. I did not need to say another word. The room filled with the ambient hum of the recording, followed by Sloane's voice. It sounded sharper, more brittle than it did in her memory. The demand for water, the specific humiliating command to fetch the expensive brand hung in the air, stripping away her mask of politeness. And then, the snap. It wasn't just a sound, it was a punctuation mark of disrespect. The general counsel stopped writing. Mercer flinched visibly. Then came my voice, calm, controlled, speaking Japanese. I let the recording play until the door clicked shut. I did not sabotage the meeting, I said, looking directly at Mercer. I apologize for the fact that your creative director treated a billionaire client like an inconvenience. And I apologized for the fact that she attempted to turn your lead architect into a waitress to cover up her own lack of preparation. Sloane stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is illegal!" she shouted, her composure finally shattering. "You can't record me. This is a violation of my privacy." The general counsel looked up, his voice quiet but lethal. "Sit down, Sloane. You're in a corporate meeting room. You have no expectation of privacy. And frankly, you should stop talking immediately." Sloane looked around the room, seeing no allies, and sank back into her chair. I then played my final card. I projected an email I had received that morning from Chairman Kaito's office. It was brief and devastating. Asterisk. We were appalled by the lack of discipline shown by your leadership team. However, we were impressed by the integrity of Miss Vance. We are willing to reopen negotiations, but only under specific conditions regarding the project's leadership. Asterisk. The room was silent. The evidence was absolute. I had proven not only that Sloane was incompetent, but that she was a liability who had lied to the board, falsified records, and nearly cost them their biggest contract. Mercer turned his chair slowly to face Sloane. "You deleted the risk files," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You lied on an official incident report, and you snapped your fingers at a senior architect in front of a client." He turned to Linda. "Please escort Sloane to her desk to collect her personal items. I want her security credentials revoked before she reaches the elevator." Sloane tried to protest, claiming she was the vision of the company, but she was led out of the room, a ghost of the arrogance she had walked in with. When the door closed, Mercer rubbed his temples and looked at me. "The suspension is lifted," he said. "You take the lead on the Kaito project." "Wait," I said, not moving to pack my laptop. "I haven't agreed to return yet." Mercer paused. "We just fired her. You won. What else do you want?" I leaned forward, placing my hands on the mahogany table. "I didn't do this to win, Mercer. I did this to prove that this firm has lost its way. If I come back, it won't be as a lead architect." Mercer narrowed his eyes. "Then what?" I looked him dead in the eye. "I want the Vice Presidency of International Operations. I want full autonomy over the Kaito project. And I want senior partner status with 5% of the project's gross margin." The general counsel whistled softly. Mercer stared at me. "That is significant." I picked up my bag. "It is a $1.2 billion contract. And right now, I am the only person on this continent that Chairman Kaito will answer the phone for. You can let me know by the end of the day." I walked out of the boardroom and into the elevator. As the numbers counted down, I realized I wasn't worrying about the building's stability anymore. I had torn down the weak parts. Now, I was going to rebuild it, and this time, the foundation would be solid. Real power isn't about who shouts the loudest, it's about who holds the keys when the doors finally lock. I learned that day that silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. It is the sound of letting someone else dig their own grave while you calmly hold the map. If you have ever had to quietly gather your dignity and walk away from a table where respect was no longer being served, know that you are not alone. Your competence is your leverage. If this story spoke to you, like, comment, and share it with someone who is still finding the courage to demand their worth.